It's December 1846 in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The snow is 12 feet deep and still falling. Inside a makeshift shelter, a mother listens to her children crying from hunger while wind howls like a banshee through the crude cabin walls. Their food ran out weeks ago. Scattered around their camp lie the bodies of friends and family members who didn't survive. Now she faces an impossible choice that no human being should ever have to make. Will she let her surviving children starve to death, or cross the ultimate moral boundary to keep them alive? This isn't the plot of a horror movie. This is the true story of the Donner Party, one of the most haunting and controversial episodes in American history. What started as a dream of California gold and new beginnings turned into a nightmare that would forever change how we think about survival, morality, and the limits of human endurance. The Donner Party's story has everything: ambition, betrayal, heroism, and yes, unspeakable horror. But it is also a story that reveals something profound about the human condition when pushed to its absolute breaking point. In this video, we explore the tragic journey of the Donner Party, how a group of ordinary families became trapped in one of nature's most unforgiving landscapes, and why their story of survival at any cost still haunts and fascinates us nearly 180 years later. To understand how the Donner Party ended up in their horrific situation, we need to go back to the America of 1846. This was a nation obsessed with expansion, driven by what politicians called manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to stretch from sea to shining sea. California was the ultimate prize. Word was spreading about its perfect climate, fertile soil, and yes, whispers of gold that wouldn't officially be discovered until 1848. But here's the catch: getting there was a nightmare. There were no railroads, no paved roads, no GPS. Just thousands of miles of wilderness, hostile terrain, and indigenous peoples who weren't exactly thrilled about waves of settlers crossing their lands. The standard route to California was called the California Trail. It branched off from the Oregon Trail near Fort Bridger in what's now Wyoming, then wound through the treacherous Sierra Nevada mountains. The journey typically took 4 to 6 months, and timing was everything. Leave too early, and you'd face muddy trails and swollen rivers. Leave too late, and you'd risk getting caught in the mountain snows that could trap travelers for months. Most wagon trains left Independence, Missouri, in late April or early May, racing against time to reach California before winter set in. It was a gamble with death itself, and in 1846, a group of families led by a prosperous Illinois farmer named James Reed and a German immigrant named George Donner decided to roll the dice. But they weren't just gambling with the standard route. They were about to make a decision that would doom nearly half their party to death, and the other half to a moral crisis that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. James Reed was a successful furniture maker from Springfield, Illinois, the same town where Abraham Lincoln lived. Reed was ambitious, confident, and used to getting his way. He deloaded his family into what other pioneers called the Pioneer Palace car, a massive 2-story wagon complete with sleeping quarters and even a small stove. If anyone was going to make it to California in style, it was going to be James Reed. George Donner was a different kind of man, quieter, more cautious, but equally determined. At 62, he was starting over in life with his third wife, Tamsin, a former schoolteacher from Massachusetts. Tamsin was remarkable for her time, an educated woman who spoke several languages and had even written children's books. The Donners were bringing with them not just their hopes for a new life, but also a substantial fortune in cash and goods. These two families became the leaders of what would become known as the Donner Party, though the group included many other families: the Breens, the Murphys, the Eddies, and the Keysburgs, among others. In total, the party included 87 people, including 29 children, some as young as infants. Everything might have turned out fine if they had stuck to the established California Trail. But in July 1846, while camped near Fort Bridger, they encountered a smooth-talking promoter named Lansford Hastings. Hastings had written a guidebook called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, and he was actively promoting what he called the Hastings Cutoff, a supposedly shorter route that would save travelers 300 miles and weeks of travel time. The cutoff would take them south of the Great Salt Lake, through the Wasatch Mountains, across the Great Salt Lake Desert, and eventually rejoin the main California Trail. Here's the problem: Hastings had never actually traveled this route with wagons. He'd explored it on horseback with a few companions, but he had no idea whether it was actually passable for the heavy, ox-drawn wagons that pioneer families depended on. James Reed was intrigued. Always the entrepreneur, he saw an opportunity to get to California faster and with less wear on his animals and equipment. After heated discussions around the campfire, the Donner Party made their fateful decision. On July 31st, 1846, they split off from the main California Trail and followed Hastings into the unknown. It was a decision that would cost them everything. The trouble started almost immediately. The Hastings Cutoff led through the Wasatch Mountains east of the Great Salt Lake, and it quickly became clear that this was no shortcut. Instead of a clear trail, the Donner Party found themselves hacking their way through dense forests, rolling boulders out of the way, and literally carving a path through canyons barely wide enough for their wagons. What Hastings had described as a few days' travel through the mountains turned into 3 brutal weeks. The men worked from dawn to dusk with axes and saws, cutting down trees and clearing brush. The women and children waited in the sweltering heat, watching their water supplies dwindle and their oxen grow weaker by the day. Tempers began to flare. James Reed, who had been so confident about the shortcut, found himself increasingly isolated as other members of the party began to blame him for their predicament. The unity that had characterized the group at the beginning of their journey was starting to crack under the pressure. But the Wasatch Mountains were just the appetizer. The main course of their nightmare was waiting for them on the other side, the Great Salt Lake Desert, a hell's cape that would push the Donner Party to the very edge of survival. When they finally emerged from the mountains in late August, they had lost precious weeks and were already running dangerously behind schedule. But they pressed on, hoping that the worst was behind them. They had no idea that they were about to enter one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. If you've ever driven across Nevada on Interstate 80, you've seen a tamed version of what the Donner Party faced in the Great Salt Lake Desert. Imagine that same landscape without roads, without gas stations, without any sign of civilization, just an endless expanse of alkali dust, scattered sagebrush, and mirages that played tricks on your exhausted mind. Hastings had told them the desert crossing would take 2 days and 2 nights. In reality, it took them 5 days and 4 nights of pure hell. The alkali dust was so fine it got into everything. Their eyes, their lungs, their food, their water. It burned their skin and made their animals go blind. The temperature during the day was unbearable, and at night it dropped so low that they huddled together for warmth. Worse, the oxen began to collapse from thirst and exhaustion. These animals were the lifeline of any wagon train. Without them, the wagons couldn't move, and the families were stranded. One by one, the oxen began to die, forcing families to abandon precious possessions to lighten their loads. James Reed's family was hit particularly hard. They lost most of their oxen and had to abandon their luxurious palace car wagon. The man who had started the journey as one of the party's leaders was now reduced to begging other families for help transporting his wife and children. By the time they finally reached water on the other side of the desert, the Donner Party had lost dozens of oxen, several wagons, and most of their food supplies. They had also lost something else: their faith in James Reed's leadership and their trust in each other. But the worst was yet to come. They were now weeks behind schedule, and the Sierra Nevada mountains, their final obstacle, were waiting for them. Time was running out, and winter was approaching faster than they realized. By early October, the Donner Party was falling apart both physically and psychologically. They were traveling through the harsh Nevada desert. Their animals were dying, their food was running low, and tensions were at a breaking point. The stress of their situation had turned neighbors into enemies and friends into rivals. The explosion came on October 5, 1846, at a place called Gravelly Ford. An argument broke out between James Reed and John Snyder, one of the teamsters hired to help drive the wagons. The details are murky, but it started as a dispute about whose team of oxen had the right of way on a narrow section of trail. The argument escalated quickly. Snyder, frustrated and exhausted like everyone else, began whipping Reed's oxen more brutally than Reed thought was necessary. When Reed protested, Snyder turned his anger on Reed himself, striking him across the head with the butt of his whip. Reed was stunned and bleeding, but what happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a moment of rage and pain, he pulled out his knife and stabbed Snyder in the chest. Snyder staggered backward, looked down at the blood spreading across his shirt, and collapsed. He died within minutes. The Donner Party had just witnessed their first murder, and the psychological impact was devastating. These weren't hardened criminals or soldiers. They were families, neighbors, people who had started this journey trusting each other with their lives. Some members of the party, led by Louis Keseberg, demanded that Reed be hanged immediately for murder. Others argued that it had been self-defense. The debate raged for hours, with families choosing sides and the fragile unity of the group disintegrating completely. In the end, they reached a compromise that satisfied no one. Reed would be banished from the party immediately, forced to continue to California alone on horseback. He would have to abandon his wife and 4 children, trusting that the same people who wanted to hang him would somehow take care of his family. As Reed rode away into the desert, his wife Margaret and his children watched him disappear into the distance. None of them knew if they would ever see each other again. The Donner Party had lost one of its leaders and gained a burden of guilt and mistrust that would make their final challenge, crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains, even more deadly. With James Reed banished and John Snyder dead, the remaining members of the Donner Party pressed on toward California, but they were now critically behind schedule. It was mid-October, and they still had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, a range that could become impassable at any moment once the winter snows began. The party was also literally falling apart. George Donner had injured his hand badly while repairing a broken wagon axle, and the wound was becoming infected. His brother Jacob was also sick. The leadership of the party was fracturing just when they needed it most. They finally reached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains in late October. Ahead of them lay Truckee Pass, now called Donner Pass, the gateway to California and safety. Local Paiute Indians warned them that winter was coming early this year, but the exhausted emigrants had no choice but to push forward. On October 28th, they reached what is now called Truckee Lake, just a few miles from the pass itself. They were so close to California, they could almost taste it. The pass was right there, just a few thousand feet above them. On a clear day, they could probably see all the way to the Sacramento Valley. But when they woke up on the morning of October 29th, everything had changed. During the night, a massive storm had moved in from the Pacific Ocean, and the pass was now blocked by several feet of fresh snow. They tried to push through anyway, but their weakened oxen couldn't make it up the steep, snow-covered slope with the heavy wagons. They were trapped. California was less than a day's journey away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. Winter had arrived early in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and the Donner Party was about to begin the most horrific chapter of their journey. What happened next would test every moral boundary, every survival instinct, and every bond of human decency they possessed. Faced with the reality that they were trapped for the winter, the Donner Party had to make quick decisions about survival. They couldn't all stay together in one location. There wasn't enough shelter or resources. So they split into smaller groups and scattered around the eastern shore of Truckee Lake. The main group, including the Breen, Murphy, and Reed families, took shelter in an abandoned cabin left by previous travelers. It was crude, just logs chinked with mud and a dirt floor, but it was better than sleeping in the open. Other families built lean-tos and dugouts, using whatever materials they could scavenge from their wagons and the surrounding forest. About 6 miles away, near Alder Creek, the Donner families built their own separate camp. George Donner's infected hand was getting worse, and he could barely help with the construction. His wife Tamsin, the educated former schoolteacher, found herself trying to organize the building of shelters while caring for her sick husband and her young children. These weren't cozy log cabins like you might see in movies about pioneers. These were desperate, makeshift structures, barely weatherproof hovels that were more like animal dens than human homes. The roofs leaked, the walls let in wind and snow, and there was no insulation except for whatever blankets and clothing the families could spare. But the real problem wasn't shelter, it was food. The Donner Party had started their journey with enough supplies to last them through to California, but the delays caused by the Hastings Cutoff had stretched their supplies to the breaking point. The brutal crossing of the Great Salt Lake Desert had forced them to abandon much of what remained. By the time they were trapped at Truckee Lake, they had maybe a few weeks' worth of food left. They tried hunting, but game was scarce in the mountains, and most of the men were not experienced hunters. They tried fishing in the lake, but caught almost nothing. They ate their remaining oxen, then their horses, then even their dogs. As the snow continued to fall and the weeks turned into months, They began to face the unthinkable reality that their food was running out, and rescue was nowhere in sight. The first to die was Bayless Williams, James Reed's handyman, in mid-December. Williams had been sick for weeks, gradually wasting away from what was probably typhus or some other disease made worse by malnutrition and the harsh conditions. His death was a harbinger of what was to come. The combination of inadequate shelter, contaminated water, poor sanitation, and increasing starvation was creating the perfect conditions for disease and death. The weakest members of the party, the elderly, the very young, and those who were already sick, began to fail first. Next was Franklin Graves, the patriarch of one of the families. Then came several children, including some infants who couldn't survive the cold and hunger. Each death was a devastating blow to the survivors, both emotionally and practically. They were losing not just loved ones, but also hands that could work, voices that could make decisions, and bodies that could provide warmth during the brutal mountain nights. But the deaths also presented the survivors with a terrible dilemma. In the civilized world they had left behind, the dead would have been buried with dignity and ceremony. But here in the mountains, the ground was frozen solid beneath several feet of snow. Burial was practically impossible. More importantly, the survivors were starving. They had already eaten their animals, boiled leather from their shoes and harnesses, and even tried to eat bark and pine needles. Some families were down to their last few handfuls of flour or beans. And there, lying in the snow around their camps, were the bodies of their dead friends and family members. Bodies that represented the difference between life and death for the survivors. It was Patrick Breen who first spoke the unthinkable thought out loud. The devoutly Catholic Irishman, who had been keeping a diary throughout their ordeal, suggested what everyone was thinking. But no one wanted to say. They were going to have to eat the dead if they wanted to live. The moral crisis that followed would define the Donner Party's legacy forever. The decision to resort to cannibalism didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, a series of smaller moral compromises that led inevitably to the unthinkable. First, they rationalized that they were only eating people who had already died. They weren't killing anyone. Then they established rules. Families wouldn't eat their own relatives, and they would never eat children. The first known instance occurred in mid-December 1846, about 2 weeks after they had become trapped. A group of 15 people, calling themselves the Forlorn Hope, had decided to attempt to cross the pass on foot and reach California to bring back help. They were the strongest members of the party, mostly young men and women without small children to care for. The Forlorn Hope made it only a few miles before they became lost in a blizzard. For days, they wandered in circles in the wilderness, their food exhausted, their strength failing. When several members of the group died, the survivors faced the same terrible choice as those back at the lake. Antonio, a Mexican vaquero who had joined the party as a guide, was the first to die. Then came Franklin Graves. Then Uncle Billy, a teamster whose real name has been lost to history. One by one, the members of the Forlorn Hope began to consume the flesh of their dead companions. They tried to maintain some semblance of civilization and dignity. They cut the flesh into small pieces and cooked it thoroughly, telling themselves they were just eating beef or pork. They avoided the faces and hands, the parts that looked most human, but there was no disguising what they were doing. Meanwhile, back at Truckee Lake, the situation was becoming equally desperate. The deaths were mounting. Spitzer, one of the German immigrants, then several children from different families. The survivors were growing weaker and more desperate by the day. Louis Keseberg, the German immigrant who had wanted to hang James Reed, was among the first at the lake camp to cross the line into cannibalism. He later claimed that he had no choice, that it was either eat the dead or join them. Other families followed, each making their own desperate calculations about survival and morality. The Breen family, sustained by their strong Catholic faith, held out longer than most. Patrick Breen continued writing in his diary, documenting the horror around him but trying to maintain some sense of normalcy and hope. But eventually, even the Breens succumbed to the necessity of survival. Word of the Donner Party's predicament had reached California by early 1847, largely thanks to James Reed, who had made it through the mountains alone after his banishment and immediately began organizing rescue efforts. The problem was that winter weather made any rescue attempt incredibly dangerous, and finding volunteers willing to risk their lives for strangers was nearly impossible. The first rescue party, led by a frontiersman named Aquila Glover, finally reached the lake camp in late February 1847. What they found was beyond their worst nightmares. The survivors were living in filthy hovels surrounded by dismembered bodies and human bones. Some of the adults weighed less than 80 pounds, and several of the children were near death. But what shocked the rescuers most was how normal some of the survivors seemed. They were sitting around fires, cooking and eating, and carrying on conversations as if nothing unusual was happening. Only when you looked more closely could you see that they were cooking human flesh and gnawing on human bones as casually as if they were eating beef. The first rescue party could only take out a limited number of people. They had to choose who was strong enough to make the journey and who would have to wait for additional rescue attempts. It was an agonizing decision. Families were split apart, with some members leaving while others stayed behind to wait for help that might never come. James Reed arrived with the second rescue party in March, desperately searching for his wife and children. He found them alive but barely recognizable, emaciated, hollow-eyed, and psychologically traumatized by months of horror. His reunion with his family was joyful, but it was also heartbreaking. These were not the same people who had waved goodbye to him 6 months earlier. The rescue efforts continued into April, with multiple expeditions bringing out survivors in small groups. Each rescue party found fewer living people and more evidence of the horrors that had taken place. The snow around the camps was littered with human bones, skulls, and other remains that told the story of what desperate people would do to survive. Not everyone waited passively for rescue. Louis Keseberg, in particular, seemed to have developed an actual taste for human flesh. When the final rescue party reached him in April, they found him alone, well-fed, and surrounded by evidence that he had been consuming recently deceased members of the party. He claimed he was just surviving, but the rescuers suspected something darker. By April 1847, Louis Keseberg was the last member of the Donner Party still alive at Truckee Lake. When the fourth and final rescue party reached the camp, they found a scene that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Keseberg was living alone among the scattered bones and rotting remains of his former companions, but unlike the other survivors, he appeared to be in relatively good health. He was alert, articulate, and showed no signs of the extreme starvation that had characterized other survivors. What the rescuers found next horrified them. In Keseberg's cabin, they discovered pots full of human flesh, children's bones that appeared to have been deliberately broken to extract marrow, and other evidence suggesting that Keseberg hadn't just been eating the dead, he had been processing them methodically, almost professionally. Most shocking of all was the discovery of what remained of Tamsin Donner, George Donner's educated and refined wife. Tamsin had refused to leave her dying husband with earlier rescue parties, choosing to stay behind to care for him. Now both were dead, and the evidence suggested that Keseberg had consumed both of their bodies after their deaths. Keseberg maintained his innocence, insisting that he had only eaten people who were already dead and that he had never killed anyone. But the rescuers weren't convinced. They found too much flesh, too many deliberately broken bones, and too many signs that Keseberg had been thriving while others died around him. The truth about Louis Keseberg may never be fully known. Was he simply a survivor who did whatever it took to stay alive, or had months of horror and isolation turned him into something darker? The rescuers certainly believed the latter, and Keseberg would carry the stain of their suspicions for the rest of his life. What is certain is that by the time the last rescue party left Truckee Lake in April 1847, the site had become a charnel house. The snow was melting, revealing the full extent of the carnage, scattered bones, skulls, and other human remains that would haunt the Sierra Nevada mountains for years to come. Of the 87 people who had started the journey with the Donner Party, only 48 survived to reach California. The death toll was staggering. Nearly half the party had perished in the mountains, and those who survived were forever changed by what they had experienced and done. The survivors faced not just physical recovery, but also psychological trauma and social judgment. Word of their cannibalism had spread throughout California and beyond, and they found themselves both famous and infamous. Some people saw them as heroes who had done whatever it took to survive. Others viewed them as monsters who had crossed moral boundaries that should never be crossed. The children who survived were perhaps the most tragic figures of all. They had witnessed things no child should ever see, and many of them struggled with psychological problems for the rest of their lives. Some never spoke publicly about their experiences, while others became obsessed with telling and retelling their stories. James Reed, who had been banished from the party and thus avoided the worst of the horror, nevertheless carried tremendous guilt about his role in the disaster. He had been one of the primary advocates for taking the Hastings Cutoff, and he knew that his decision had contributed to the deaths of nearly 40 people. Louis Keseberg faced the harshest judgment. Even other survivors distanced themselves from him, and he was widely suspected of murder as well as cannibalism. He tried to rebuild his life in California, but the suspicions and accusations followed him wherever he went. He eventually became a recluse, bitter and isolated, insisting until his death that he had done nothing wrong. The story of the Donner Party spread rapidly throughout America and the world. It was sensationalized in newspapers, analyzed in books and articles, and became a cautionary tale about the dangers of westward expansion. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about human nature and the boundaries of civilized behavior. Nearly 180 years after the Donner Party's ordeal, their story continues to fascinate and horrify us. Part of the reason is that it forces us to confront questions about human nature that we'd rather not think about. What would we do in their situation? How far would we go to survive? What moral boundaries would we be willing to cross to save our children? These aren't just academic questions. Throughout history, people have faced similar choices during famines, wars, sieges, and natural disasters. The story of the Donner Party is extreme, but it's not unique. What makes it particularly compelling is how well documented it is, thanks to Patrick Breen's diary and the detailed accounts of the survivors and rescuers. Modern psychologists and ethicists have studied the Donner Party case extensively, trying to understand the psychological processes that led to their moral compromises. What they've found is that extreme situations can push people beyond their normal moral boundaries, creating what psychologists call moral injury, the deep psychological damage that comes from either committing acts you believe are wrong or witnessing such acts without being able to prevent them. The survivors of the Donner Party suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, anxiety attacks, and difficulty forming normal relationships. Some became obsessed with food and eating, while others could barely bring themselves to eat at all. The psychological scars lasted for decades, affecting not just the survivors themselves, but their children and grandchildren. But the story also raises questions about how we judge people who face impossible choices. Is it fair to condemn someone for doing whatever it takes to survive? Do normal moral standards apply in extreme situations? These questions don't have easy answers, and they make the Donner Party story more than just a historical curiosity. They make it a mirror that reflects our own humanity back at us. The Donner Party tragedy had immediate and lasting effects on American westward expansion. The Hastings Cutoff was quickly abandoned as a viable route, and future immigrants were warned about the dangers of taking untested shortcuts. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper planning, adequate supplies, and experienced leadership. But the legacy goes deeper than just practical lessons about pioneer travel. The Donner Party story became part of American mythology, a dark chapter that revealed both the best and worst of the human spirit. It showed how ordinary people could display extraordinary courage and self-sacrifice, but also how civilized behavior could break down under extreme pressure. The location of their ordeal, now called Donner Lake and Donner Pass, became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Thousands of travelers on their way to California would stop to see where the tragedy had occurred. Today, Interstate 80 passes directly through Donner Pass, and millions of travelers drive over the exact spot where the Donner Party was trapped, most of them unaware of the horror that took place there. The story has been retold countless times in books, movies, documentaries, and academic studies. Each generation seems to find new meanings and lessons in the tragedy. During the Great Depression, it was seen as a story about perseverance in the face of economic hardship. During World War II, it became a parable about the importance of unity and cooperation. In more recent times, it's been analyzed through the lens of environmental history, women's studies, and psychological trauma. What emerges from all these retellings is a complex picture of human nature under extreme stress. The Donner Party story shows us that people are capable of both incredible selfishness and remarkable altruism, often within the same individual. Some members of the party shared their last scraps of food with strangers' children, while others hoarded supplies and looked out only for themselves. The story also highlights the role of leadership in crisis situations. The Donner Party's troubles began with poor decision-making and worsened due to failed leadership. When James Reed was banished and George Donner became incapacitated, the group had no strong leader to make the hard decisions that might have prevented some of the deaths. As we reach the end of this dark chapter in American history, it is worth reflecting on why the story of the Donner Party continues to captivate us nearly 2 centuries later. It's not just the sensational aspects of cannibalism and survival, though those elements certainly grab our attention. It's what the story reveals about the thin veneer of civilization and how quickly it can disappear when people are pushed to their absolute limits. The men and women of the Donner Party weren't monsters when they started their journey. They were ordinary people with ordinary dreams, farmers and merchants, parents and children, all seeking a better life in California. They had the same hopes and fears, the same moral codes and social expectations as any of us. What happened to them could, in theory, happen to anyone under the right circumstances. That's what makes their story so unsettling and so compelling. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own nature. We like to think we're civilized, moral people who would never cross certain boundaries. But the Donner Party shows us that moral boundaries are more fragile than we'd like to believe, and that survival instincts can override even our deepest convictions. Yet the story is not entirely dark. Alongside the horror and moral compromise, we also see examples of incredible courage, selflessness, and love. Parents who gave their last food to their children. Strangers who shared their meager supplies with others. Rescuers who risked their lives repeatedly to save people they had never met. The human capacity for evil is matched by an equally powerful capacity for good. Perhaps most importantly, the Donner Party story reminds us of the importance of the choices we make before we face extreme situations. The tragedy began not with the winter storms or the lack of food, but with the decision to take an untested shortcut. It was compounded by failures of leadership, preparation, and cooperation. The moral crisis they faced in the mountains was the culmination of a series of smaller failures and bad decisions. In our own lives, we may never face the extreme choices that confronted the Donner Party, but we all face moments when we must choose between the easy path and the right path, between self-interest and the common good, between expedience and principle. The story of the Donner Party suggests that these smaller choices matter more than we might think, that they shape who we become and determine how we respond when we face our own moments of crisis. The 48 survivors of the Donner Party went on to live full lives in California and beyond. Some became successful farmers and business owners. Others struggled with the psychological aftermath of their ordeal for decades. A few, like Louis Keseberg, never fully escaped the shadows of what happened in the mountains. But all of them carried forward the knowledge of what human beings are capable of, both the worst and the best. Their story serves as both a warning and a testament, a reminder of how quickly civilization can crumble, but also of how stubbornly the human spirit can endure. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of the Donner Party, not the specific details of their horror, but the broader truth about resilience, choice, and the complex nature of human morality under pressure. The next time you drive through the Sierra Nevada mountains or face a difficult decision in your own life, remember the Donner Party. Remember that our choices have consequences, that leadership matters, and that the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than we'd like to believe. But also remember that even in the darkest circumstances, people are capable of extraordinary acts of love, sacrifice, and courage. That may be the most important legacy of the Donner Party, not the horror of what they did to survive, but the reminder of what we're all capable of, for better and for worse, when pushed to our absolute limits.